All right, there we go. Forge gang! I am still a hard man. Let's go! Lion-O! Thunder! Thunder! Thundercats! Ho! Alrighty then, so I'm going to talk about the Thundercats 1985 to 1989 by Rankin Bass. Yeah, Rankin Bass. Rankin Bass, I think, got its start as a toy company, and then it moved up to becoming. It produced children's animated content and stuff, usually for the holidays. So for the holidays, they'd make these stop motion shorts and stuff. Rankin Bass was known for making stop motion animation for holiday stuff. You probably might remember some of it. There's this snowman cartoon from the 1960s. I think it's Frosty the Snowman. They made that, and they made many others that I can't think of at the moment. But anyways, in the 1980s, there was deregulation with media content and stuff. Ronald Reagan deregulated a whole bunch of industries and things, and one of the things, probably it was negative in the long run, but one of the things that they did was they opened the floodgates for children's entertainment. If you grew up in the 70s, or in the early 80s too, you might remember that children's entertainment was very regulated, actually. You had stuff like, what was it called? Captain Kangaroo. Sesame Street was popular. The Muppets. And what else was there? Schoolhouse Rock. Then you go into the 1980s, and all of a sudden you have this just coming out of like He-Man, Masters of the Universe, Spider-Man, The Adventures of Spider-Man, The Fantastic Four, The Transformers, and G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero, and a whole bunch of action-packed content like that that really did not focus on the educational quality, didn't really focus a lot on education or kind of teaching as a subject, but instead focused on action, adventure, fiction, fantasy, and superheroes. Comic books were making a very big comeback. In the 1950s, comic books had been very heavily censored, and all of a sudden by the 1980s, there was this big explosion of sorts on the scene of Marvel and DC Adventures. There was sort of this new rehashing of Superman. The Superman movies were a big impact on that as well. Another thing, too, in the early 80s was Star Wars. Star Wars completely dominated pop culture. Star Wars had a huge, tremendous influence. And then later in the 80s, you had some Star Trek movies. And then there was The Next Generations, and that had a very big influence on the media of the time. And so this is the kind of frame in which Thundercats 85 came into the fray. So Thundercats, the idea was a family-oriented project. It definitely took a lot of influence from He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, but it was more family-oriented in a way. It was also much more friendly to women. Thundercats had kind of a bit of a feminist influence in it as well. but it really did cater on teamwork. He-Man was more of this alpha male, Conan the Barbarian adventure, and it tended to focus more on just He-Man fighting the bad guys, such as Skeletor, Beastman, and Serpentor. And Thundercats was more, let's work as a team. We're Thundercats. Let's work together as a team and let's fight the bad guys and stuff, but let's focus more on teamwork. One of the things about Thundercats is they hired a psychiatrist. They actually hired like a child therapist or a child psychiatrist to write in scripts for each of the episodes, which I thought was really unusual, especially for the time. The 1980s was known for its like kind of freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, and it was a really very open-minded decade, the decade of Rambo, the decade of Rocky, the boxer, like the idea that a cartoons television show, an action television show for kids in the 80s would have a psychologist writing in with the scripts really surprised me. The voice actor cast that was picked weren't really big names in the industry. Another interesting thing about Thundercats too is they did not actually hire animators who had had previous experience with directing animated stuff before. Instead, they hired cartoonists, people that did comic books, or people that worked on comic books, and not really those that had been working in the animation industry. They were rookies to this. Likewise, the voice actors were relatively new to the scene as well. And so, another one of the big impacts of the Thundercats was that it brought anime to the States. It had a very tremendously big impact in that it brought anime, Japanese anime, and kind of the art style of anime, even though Thundercats was actually not an anime. It was produced in America and voice cast in America. It was animated in Japan by the Asia Pacific Company, but together with shows like Robotech, Voltron, Savior of the Universe, and the earlier Speed Racer, it was one of the major first exposures for a lot of Western audiences at the time to anime. In fact, it might actually be the first American-produced cartoon series to have an anime art style. And this is before Ghibli movies blew up in the 1990s in popularity. Really, even before Voltron came on the scene. The only show that I can think of that had an anime influence that was earlier than Thundercats was Speed Racer and Robotech. So, for a lot of people, for a lot of the audience, adults and kids alike, their first major exposure to anime was the Thundercats, or through watching the Thundercats. It was none of the other action-oriented shows of this time period had anime influence like the Thundercats did. So, very big influence, probably the biggest influence of all. So, like every other 1980s cartoon series, it heavily focused on the production and sales of toys. There was a heavy emphasis on toy production and toy making, creating toys and pitching sales for toys to TV ads and stuff, and that was important as well. Anyways, 2 pilot episodes were released, and the Dynamite Comics issue of Thundercats was released about the same time. Some comic book releases, and in 1985, the pilot episode called Exodus was released, which talked about how Thunderian exiles were escaping and leaving Thundera. Thundera blew up, and they had the Sword of Omens in the Eye of Thundera, And Jaga the Wise was the lord of the Thundercats, and he gave Tigra, Shitara, Panthra, Wily Kit, Wily Cat, and Lion-O their uniforms, insignia, and stuff, and that's how they become Thundercats. The mutants attack Slide, Monkeyan, Jackal Man, and Vulture Man, and those guys, and they attack. And they almost seize the Eye of Thundera, or the Sword of Omens, and they end up escaping. They retreat and they leave, but they destroy all the fleet except the royal flagship, which is damaged. And they end up having to go to Third Earth, but it takes a very long time to get to Third Earth. So they do that. They land on Third Earth. Jaga dies. He goes to the astral plane. He comes back as a ghost. Jaga comes back as a Force ghost or something like Obi-Wan Kenobi. Snarf wakes Lion-O up. The mutants come down and they attack. And Lion-O proclaims himself to be Lord of the Thundercats. Lion-O, the Lord of the Thundercats. And he uses the power of the Sword of Omens to wake up the other Thundercats. And they very quickly outsmart and chase out the mutants. And then they start taking the wreck from the spaceship to build a new cat's lair. Panthro builds a thunder tank. Episode 2, which is the second pilot episode, is Unholy Alliance. They're building the cat's lair, and Panthro already has the thunder tank built up. And so, anyways, they start collecting up things for the new cat's lair. Slythe, Jackal Man, and Monkeyan crash in the sands of no return, or the desert of no return. They end up going into a black obelisk pyramid, and they meet Mum Ra, the evil ancient sorcerer of all things evil, and he is woke up by the ancient spirits of evil, and Mum Ra sends the mutants to fight Lion-O, telling him that he's alone in the jungle, and Lion-O quickly beats them. So Mum Ra transforms into Mum Ra, the Ever-Living. And he goes and he fights Lion-O, but Lion-O finds his secret weakness, which is his reflection. And so Mum Ra retreats and goes back into his crypt. His second weakness is he has to go back into his crypt after a certain amount of time. And those are the 2 pilot episodes, and so not long thereafter, they released a new toy line. Commercials for selling the toys were released, and the pilot episodes had been successful, and there was pretty decent TV ratings. So they ordered 65 episodes, 65 licensed episodes of the Thundercats, and it's just various one-term episodes. They meet the Burbles. They meet the warrior maidens of the Treetop Kingdom. They run into Snowman and Snow Meow, and they run into, like, the Burbles, which are like the Thundercats version of the Ewoks. Fun fact, I think George Lucas actually tried to file a lawsuit against Thundercats because of copyright infringement of his Ewoks from the Return of the Jedi. But I'm not for sure about that one. But anyways, so they go on all these different adventures. They meet, Targarson, Tarmagar the Tuscan, Snowman, Snow Meow. They meet up with the Burbles, with the, giants, with, unicorns. They fight Hammerhand and the Berserker Pirates. The mutants come back with inventions. They eventually retrieve their spaceship wreckage, and they reuse their weapons again. The Nosedivers and the Nosediver and Sky Shredders, or Sky Sweepers, which is basically kind of just reinterpretations of, like, the Galactic Empire's weaponries and the like. Mum Ra comes back in different episodes and tries to do different ploys and stuff, like Mum Ra, the Dream Master. He tries to get Wiz Ra's hat to try to use it for power or something. And he tries to ensnare the Thundercats numerous times. At first, he wants to try to get the Sword of Omens to try to get the power of the Eye of Thundera, but it backfires. About midway through the series, there is a 2-part episode where Rattaro, who has the daggers of Plundar with the Eye of Plundar, he kidnaps Snarfer, who comes back in season 2 and later, and they try to have a ploy where the Thundercats have to fight the Rat Star, and they eventually defeat Rattaro. It's a 2-episode. And then there is Lion-O's anointment trials. There is a trial for strength where he has to compete with Panthro for strength competition. There is the trial of speed where he races Shitara. The trial of cunning with Wily Kit and Wily Cat. There's the trial of mind power where he has to fight with Tigra. And then finally there is the trial of absolute evil where he has to fight Mum-Ra without the Sword of Omens. And he does it by destroying Mum-Ra's crypt, by throwing it into the magical pool of evil or magical incantational enchantment, but Mum-Ra survives. So the ancient spirits of evil make Mum-Ra to be able to survive without just having one crypt, I guess. I don't know. There's other episodes like Willa, and Tigra become invisible and they have to find a way to become uninvisible and they get trapped in Castle Plundar. There are the slaves of Castle Plundar. There's a episode where they have to retrieve a memory storage device thing, and Lion-O gets sent back in time, and he meets his father, Claudius, King Claudius, the previous Lord of the Thundercats on Thundera, old Thundera, by the way. And those are kind of the 65 episodes. Anyways, they did pretty good. The ratings were decent. And then in 1986, a whole bunch of different animated movies came out. Transformers the movie, My Little Pony the movie, and G.I. Joe the movie. A whole bunch of different movies came out and were released, and they did not do very well in the box office. They were box office flops. I think only the Transformers movie actually really succeeded. So they decided to make an animated movie called Thundercats Ho! And then they noticed, or they paid attention, that these movies were not doing good in the theaters. So they turned it into a television movie called Thundercats Ho! It was released in 1986. And they later turned it into 5 different episodes. Also, some Thundercats video games got released. Thundercats The Lost Eye of Thundera was released in 1987 on the Commodore 64, and a total of 3 or 4 different Thundercats games were released on many different consoles, on the Sega Genesis, on the Nintendo, the original Nintendo, and also on the Commodore 64 and other devices in the mid to late 80s, 86, 87, 88, thereabouts. Anyways, Thundercats Ho! Did not do very well. The ratings were falling, so there was a change. It was decided that they were going to cut the budget on the Thundercats, and this is when the Thundercats started to go under. Season 2 was only 20 episodes, and it came in starting with Mum-Ra Lives, or Mum-Ra Survives or Lives, 5-episode series. And then they did 15 episodes, single episodes. And they brought in the Lunatics, who were not very popular with the audience. A lot of people didn't like the Lunatics. Some did, some didn't. They brought in some new characters and new territories. Also, some new Thundercats came in. Linkso, Palmyra, and Bengali. They were introduced. Monmut was also introduced. The Berserkers and Hammerhand came back, kind of. And so there was a lot of episodes, especially episodes that focused more on the Lunatics. and the like. And then after season 2, they ordered another 20 episodes called season 3, beginning with Thunder Cubs. Basically, Mum Ra recreates Thundera. It is called New Thundera. And the sword of Plundar from Rataro, or Ratilla, the ancestor of Rataro, as well as the treasures of Thundera are rediscovered. Mum Ra has a new pyramid, and he can get even stronger now. And so there's new episodes that mainly revolve around trying to reclaim the treasures of Thundera, and different single episodes that describe what these treasures are, what their powers are, and what they do. The mutants also kind of make a bit of a comeback after hardly being seen in season 2 episodes. And I think that this is kind of where the Thundercats started to get bad. Personally, I would have brought in Malkar, Frogman, and Shadow Master in season 3. And then I would have ditched Mum Ra and replaced him with Shadow Master, because Shadow Master and Malkar were actually even stronger magicians than Mum Ra was. But no, they're not going to do anything that's actually cool. They're going to reuse and rehash the same stuff from season 1 and season 2. So season 3 didn't do very good. And season 4, which was another 20 episodes, in season 4, they get rid of the mutants and the Lunatics, so they're gone. Although Vulture Man has a couple of episodes, and there is one episode where Captain Cracker and the Lunatics team up, but those are the exceptions. Villains like Frogman, Malkar the Alchemist, and Shadow Master, who had Lion-O's ancestor Claudius imprisoned in the Shadow Realm, make appearances. Anyways, it begins with the 5-episode marathon, Return to New Thundera. It's Return to Thundera. I don't know why, they didn't just add New Thundera. But anyways, so Lion-O and the other Thundercats leave Third Earth. They build a new cat's lair on New Thundera. And they have new vehicles and stuff, and season 4 mainly focuses on having to rebuild the gyroscope and save Chigala from the clutches of Mum Ra. Mum Ra is trying to turn the gravity of New Thundera against the Thundercats and is trying to blow the planet up. And he still has the Sword of Plundar and all of that. And they fight Mum Ra, who actually was banished to the Nether Realms, but escaped, or the ancient spirits of evil brought him back. This is when these new villains appear, and the season 4 episodes were not that good anyway, so by the 1990s, attitudes in regards to violence in children's cartoons was changing, and there was an activist group that was pushing back against it, and so a bit more censorship in regards to cartoon violence was put into place. Also, the popularity of action character toys began to fall, and just because it was 1989, it was going into the 90s, you had new things like Shark Troops, Shark Crew, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and a whole bunch of other shows were coming along that were already getting really high in popularity. And it just really seemed that people had their taste of the original, of the OG Thundercats. And so episode 20 of season 4, The Book of Omens, is the last episode. And it kind of ends a lot like Silverhawks episode 46 did. It ends on a pretty bland note. Lion-O defeats Mum Ra and the greatest, strongest champion in the Book of Omens world. And they ultimately do save New Thundera, but there is new challenges that have yet to be seen, and that's it. That's the Thundercats, 1985 to 1989. A pretty good movie. A pretty good series overall. Some of the episodes of the later seasons, like midway through season 2 and on, maybe with the exception of maybe in regards to like some receptions in episodes in season 3 and season 4, Shadow Master was pretty good, but most of the seasons from season 2 onwards are not really that great. When the toy sales were doing really good, the TV ratings for the show was pretty high, but once new action adventure cartoons came along for the kids to watch, it kind of dragged the audience away, and the toy sales plummeted and the TV ratings fell. Apparently, there is a very mixed reception at the time in regards to the 80s Thundercats. It had a very mixed reception, a mixed to positive reception. Later, the series would re-air on Toonami on Cartoon Network because Warner Brothers bought up Rankin Bass and Telecom Pictures. Well, actually, Telecom Pictures bought Rankin Bass or Rankin Jass, and then Warner Brothers bought them out. And so Warner Brothers re-aired the Thundercats on some television shows like Cartoon Network. And I don't really know too much about what the popularity was for it. It was an old series by then. It had had its run. It had seen its heyday. But actually, I think people still enjoyed it because it ran on Toonami for a pretty long time. It was also on Toonami's Midnight Sun as well for a while. Anyways, I give the Thundercats an 8 out of 10. I've already mentioned this on an earlier stream. The characters were okay, I guess. The stories were sort of alright, but the ultimate message slipped out. It was like, after a certain amount of episodes, Mum Ra and the mutants just lost their purpose. And the whole symbolism of the forces of good versus evil kind of lost its meaning and purpose in Thundercats. The later episodes just tended to really sort of mimic Star Wars and Star Trek a bit too much, whereas the earlier episodes tended to focus more on a comic book kind of adventure theme. And also, they matured the message way too much. The thing about the Thundercats that really, it became too mature to an audience that really were not interested in that. The psychological evaluations of the characters, the therapeutic interpretations, the ecological messages, the virtue signaling, the overt feminism was, I'm not saying it was bad that they had female characters. Of course, it was absolutely good there were female representation, but the feminist qualities or the feminist stuff tended to really not do a very good. It tended to not really do a very great purpose. Also, the earlier episodes did better at explaining and talking about single character development that the later episodes failed to do. Snarf was very annoying. Snarf had his good moments, but generally Snarf and Snarfer, who comes along later, were not really that interesting of characters. The new Thundercats did not really get the limelight that they deserved, and the story just lost its purpose, especially once you get to season 3. It's just amounting to simple treasure digging, and then season 4, it's like, what are you going with this? So it's no surprise that the Thundercats ended in 1989 as it did. I personally believe that it could have continued for a few more years in the 90s. I don't see how it could not have continued. So Thundercats had a total of 130 episodes. It had very interesting music. It was a sort of an early attempt of Americanizing anime and trying to bring that theme over to make it popular in the U.S. I think it had very mixed results at best. The real upgrowth in the popularity of anime only happened in the early 2000s. It was still way too early in the 80s for that. It was still way too early in the 80s to really go into that anyways. And so Thundercats has a lot of fans and stuff. There were rock concerts. There were conventions where the actors would sign signatures and stuff, almost like a Star Trek convention. There were a few comic book issues released, and like I already said, there was toy lines. There was a bunch of toy lines for like the Thunder Tank and Panthro, Mum Ra's Magic Crypt, the amazing Cat's Lair, the Tower of Omens, and generally the vehicles and the characters got some toy releases. Really the toys that were perhaps the most important aspect at the time that it was running on air. They almost had a theatrical release, but instead they released Thundercats Ho onto television instead of doing a theater release. And to date, there has actually been no movies or no movie releases of the Thundercats, which is interesting. 4 video games of the Thundercats were made and released, and ultimately, as the 1990s began, people moved on to the new themes and the new shows of the 1990s, and the Thundercats were relatively forgotten. There were some promos and, probably a few conventions, typically comic book related in the later on, but up until 2011, there was no new release by Warner Brothers of a new Thundercats. There was talks about a movie and stuff, and like a rebooting and a remake or reboot of the Thundercats, but nothing came of it. And so I will talk about that next time. So I am your host, Imperator of Forge, leader of Forge Gang, and this is my review of the Thundercats, 1985 to 1989, the original Thundercats. I suppose that I could go ahead and talk about some of the voice actors. So Thundercats was a creation of comic books veteran cartoonist Leonard Starr. Let me see here. No. Let's see here. Oh, by the way, the voice actor of Jackalman and the voice actor of Lion-O are the same. Here, let me bring up the cast. Alright, that's it. So Larry Carey was the voice of Lion-O. Leni Lipton was the voice of Chitara and Wily Cat. And Earl Hammond was the voice of Jaga the Wise and Mum Ra. And a few other characters. Not very well-known voice actors, unfortunately. Thundercats was dreamed up by Leonard Starr. Him and his family wrote and drew on napkins their ideas of like half cat, half feline, half humanoid characters. And they sent it to Rankin Bass, and by 1985, they got the green light to produce the Thundercats. So, overall, I give the Thundercats an 8 out of 10. I definitely recommend at least watching Season 1. If anything, at least watch the better rated episodes of Season 1 and see if you even like it. The pilot episodes and Lion-O's Anointment episodes and the Thundercats Ho episodes are also pretty good as well. You might not like the season, the second and later seasons of the Thundercats. It's a hit and miss, but Yeah, it's very good. It's a very good cartoon series. It's kind of aged. It's aged very well. If you're a fan of Star Trek, especially, you'll like the Thundercats. Anyways, I'm Imperator Forge, and thank you for watching. This has been my review of the Thundercats, 1985 to 1989.